Section 3 of the Western Boundary and Other Essays by Helmuth von Moltke, translated by Charles Flint McClumpher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. The Western Boundary, Part 2. After Louis XIV had acquired possession of this German bulwark, he was no longer in need of a Rhenish confederation, nor of the princes of Western Germany. From this stronghold his armies could quickly invade the Palatinate and Swabia, and rob and rule after their heart's desire. Discarding the old mask of friendship, he carried death and desolation into the lands of the same princes whom he had so long flattered as their beloved protector. He next desired to gain possession of the whole electorate of the Palatinate of the Rhine, for his brother, Philip of Orleans, who had espoused the sister of the Elector, Charles Louis. He did this with still greater arrogance, for the Elector was still living, and legal heirs of the House of Wittelsbach were not wanting. A demon in human form suggested to the king that he would be most sure of securing his object if he frightened the feeble and discordant imperial princes of Germany, that they would consent to the most disadvantageous treaty if he should terrify them as they had never before been. Therefore, he ordered that the cities and villages of the peaceful and prosperous Palatinate, of the neighbouring electorate of Mayence, of the Margrave of Baden, and even of the Duchy of Württemberg, should be plundered and burned to the ground, the inhabitants robbed, abused, insulted, murdered, as if Attila had returned with the Huns. They burned Worms, Spires, Frankenthal, Alzey, Andernach, Kochheim, Oberwesel, Kreuznach, Mannheim, Ladenburg, Weinheim, Gernsheim, Heppenheim, Oppenheim, Dolach, Bruchsal, Rastal, Baden, Bretten, Pforzheim, etc. In the second invasion, Heidelberg, Hirschau, Kalv, Neuenberg, Knittlingen, Marbach, Weihingen, etc., not including numerous hamlets and villages, were destroyed. And Louis XIV did all this without having been injured in the least by Germany, and this king boasted of being at the head of civilization. However, his plan did not wholly succeed. In Mayence, General Thungen bravely resisted him, a man whom our country's history has also ungratefully forgotten. The empire bestirred itself again. The emperor had just become the master of the Turks in the east, and so Louis XIV, by the Treaty of Ryswick, tear away, as people then said, had to rest contented with what the Treaty of Nijmegen secured to him, and with Strasbourg, and the imperial towns of Alsace, which had already been most cruelly treated, and partly burned to the ground by him. But he did not get the Palatinate, and he was obliged to give back Freiburg to Breisgau in the year of 1697. To him, Strasbourg was far more important strategically than Freiburg, and besides he founded the fortress of Huningen, a cannon's shot distance from Bâle, in order to gain a broad basis for operation on the Upper Rhine. The Swiss murmured, but he reconciled them and bribed their regents by annual payments and military stipends, so that he was not at all apprehensive of them. They were also, practically, pleased with everything. They continued to furnish him with numerous regiments, and actually forgot that he had cut off their trade with Alsace and Burgundy. The policy of the Swiss Confederation at that time is the most despicable that republics have ever had to be ashamed of. When Louis seized the free city of Strasbourg, a republic that had for ages been allied to the Swiss, and had often rendered them assistance in their combats, he was not only not opposed by the Swiss, but they sent their ambassadors to him and courted him in the most servile manner, serving him at table in their official dress and receiving presents of money from him. Soon after that, just at the close of the century, the family of Philip II in Spain died out, and the German line of the House of Habsburg laid claim to his rich inheritance. But the elder daughter of the last of the Habsburgs in Spain had been married to a grandson of Louis XIV, and this made good the female succession. Apart from the official and family importance of this matter of inheritance, it was very natural that France should necessarily fear a consolidation of Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, and Milan with the German Empire, a restoration of the great monarchy of Charles V, quite as much as Germany had to be alarmed at an increase of French power through this Spanish inheritance, policy also necessarily forbade a decision of this suit by the sword. This time, Germany had the advantage of having England on its side. Whenever England acted in union with Germany, France was overpowered. Moreover, Prince Eugene of Savoy, who was at heart the best German of those times, took his place at the head of the imperial army, and wrought wonders in military art against the French, as he had done against the Turks. Then Louis, who was growing old, saw himself humbled at last, saw his arrogant generals and armies defeated, his treasures vainly squandered. But his cunning and good luck saved him. England broke from Germany, and left Prince Eugene in the lurch, in the presence of the French, left the German diplomats in the lurch at the time of negotiations, and by its faithless policy caused us to lose again the fruits of such long and glorious battles. Yet France could gain Spain only, and Spain continued to be, under the rule of Louis's grandson, a kingdom separate from France, while the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, and Milan passed directly over to Austria in the year 1713. But all these advantages were soon swept away again, because Emperor Charles VI had no son, and in order to secure the succession for his celebrated daughter, Maria Theresa, he purchased the consent of other states, especially France, with great sacrifices. For this purpose he surrendered Naples and Lorraine to France of his own accord. The important surrender of Lorraine was at that time still kept a secret, because Francis, the young Duke of Lorraine, who married Maria Theresa, received Tuscany instead of Lorraine, and Lorraine itself was provisionally given to the dethroned King of Poland, Stanisław Leszczyński, who, however, had no son, and after whose death, 1766, France actually came into possession of the much and long-desired Lorraine. Naples became an independent kingdom under a French king belonging to the house of Louis XIV, as did Spain. In this manner France acquired what it still holds today, acquired it from Germany by robbery, by base robbery in the midst of peace, or by fraudulent use of our misfortune. It acquired the ancient kingdom of Burgundy, the valley of the Rhone, from Geneva to Marseille, at the time of our misfortune, when the Hohenstaufens became extinct. It acquired the bishoprics of Lorraine at the time of our misfortune, during the Reformation. It acquired Alsace at the time of our misfortune in the 30 Years' War. At the time of our feebleness in the midst of peace, it seized upon the earldom of Burgundy, a part of the Netherlands and Strasbourg. At the time of our feebleness, and through the family compact of Charles VI, which was the most injurious to all German interests, it won by a stroke of the pen beautiful Lorraine, so long loyal to the German Empire. The family of Louis XIV ruled now, both in Spain and Naples. All that France acquired, it acquired at the expense of Germany. The loss of the ancient kingdom of Burgundy and of Naples, also of the free earldom of Burgundy, of Italian Lorraine and of Italian Arras, etc., was a great political loss, if not a national one. By the loss of Alsace and German Lorraine, moreover, we were deeply injured in our national interests. These fine provinces were severed like a sound limb from the living body of Germany, and were subjected to the influence of a foreign nationality. But the worst was that by this example it was clearly proved that the German nation had lost its ancient precedence in Europe. Until this time, Romance and Slavonic peoples had been subject to German masters. Now, for the first time, German people were subject to foreign masters. What the Romance state in the West had done, that was also done now by the Slavic state in the East, and France had hardly taken Alsace from us, when Russia, also on the other side, took from us German Livland. As we were defeated by the French on the field, as we had allowed them unpunished to wrest German provinces from us, so also German spirit, as the result of this, was subjected to the French. The external losses kept pace with the internal degeneration of Germany. Was it the cause, or was it the result? Matters not. All feeling for German national honour and strength and loyalty, upon which the German had once relied for his nationality, died out when the French made their advances against Germany. The German courts and the German nobility, patterned after the court of Louis XIV, copied his despotism, his taste and his extravagances. They suppressed the Old German, the popularly traditional liberties both of the states and the cities. They eagerly adopted the system of Louis XIV, the new doctrine of absolute power, and they voluntarily served as organs of the great Gallic-Roman reaction against Germanism. We have already viewed the modern despotism of Louis XIV as the result of that national reaction, this Romance element which had been so long vanquished, and which under the sacred flag of the Roman hierarchy had vainly battled against the German element, and was again overwhelmed by the Reformation, now attained under the secular flag of French despotism an undisputed victory. Every popular right, every ancient form of popular representation was destroyed on German soil, or was degraded to an empty formality. All German governments adopted the French forms, the centralization of power, the bureaucracy. In the modern forms were now repeated the forms of the ancient Roman Empire, with its vice-regencies and prefectures. Therefore, the old Roman law, after having long clashed with the German provincial and civic laws, now first gained firm foothold in Germany, which never could have happened had the desire for absolute power not come to its assistance. At the same time, the courts and nobles in Germany adopted the French language, and were ashamed to speak their good old mother tongue any longer, and so German literature was despised by the nobles, and French was introduced in its stead. In the same way, strict German morality was expelled from among the princes and nobles. They travelled to Paris to cultivate themselves, and they brought all sorts of fashions back to Germany with them, numerous pleasure castles, even for the clergy, displayed to the astonished citizen and peasant in Germany the resurrected splendour and revelry of the Roman heathen festivities, abounding in mythology and debauchery. In this way there vanished from the courts, and from among the nobles, ancient and beautiful costumes, and this new Parisian fashion was imitated in Germany, first by the nobles, then by the middle class. To a certain degree clothes make the man, so it was by no means a matter of little importance that Germany lowered itself and servilely donned the dismantled garments of the French. It is moreover remarkable that the new French fashions, though they were constantly changing without cause, were never exchanged for beautiful fashions, but on the contrary always for ugly fashions, and altogether they were patterns of every possible form of unnaturalness, unwholesomeness, and ugliness. From the extensive wigs, hoop petticoats, and ruffles of Louis XIV's time, down to the frocks and big sleeves, all French fashions during those 2 centuries present nothing that could compare with the older national costumes for dressiness, elegance, beauty, and appropriateness. In this compliance of Europe to the legislation of the ugly, there is a remarkable example of the irony of universal history. At the same time, this symbolically expresses the total unnaturalness of the French ascendancy. Finally, French influence exerted a great power over German literature, which had apparently remained independent of it, and had even taken up sides against it. It is true that a reaction on the part of German literature against the French began with Lessing, that the attack upon Gottsched, the leader of the French school, encouraged almost all the young minds contemporaneous with and following Lessing, and gave new impetus to German science and poetry. Although these young minds were courageously and decisively repelling the direct influence of France, yet, without being conscious of it, they were subjected to its indirect influence. Without the example of French literature, as an illustration, German writers would never have departed so far from the Christian point of view, and so closely approached the heathen antique position as they have done. And without the despotic forms of government derived from France, German writers would never have departed so far from a national and patriotic point of view, and been impelled to a position so completely individual on the one side, so cosmopolitan on the other, as actually was the case. After the passionate struggles of the Reformation, the religious mind of the German schools also fell asleep, and nothing took its place except classical studies and French fashionable literature. Therefore, the young minds in Germany involuntarily accustomed themselves to heathen and un-German models, and hardly conceived the richness of German intellectual and artistic life as it had been evolved during the Middle Ages. Although in their opposition to the French they began to become conscious of themselves, yet it was a consciousness felt only in order to compete with the French in the imitation of the antique, for they boasted that they understood the antique better than the French. And if they had a suspicion that that of itself was not sufficient, and that art blossoms would spring up again from the German root, still more beautiful than those already produced in the hothouse of classicism, they did not yet know how to find this root in their native soil, and they borrowed all the implements for Germanic reaction from their kinsmen, the English. The intellectual men of Germany were debarred from all participation in public affairs. They were excluded from all cooperation in governmental affairs through despotic and aristocratic forms of government. They were appointed to poor scholastic positions or to pensions granted by the princes. They were intimidated by the outer world, and were driven to the world of imagination. They belonged to some independent province, but as yet they knew of the German Empire as a whole only in the form of a caricature, which was even then a subject of ridicule. Therefore they studied only to gain some kind of a livelihood, to get a position in their province, and by this office to become cosmopolitans. While they were conscious that they were at one extreme of littleness, that their vocation was an exceedingly narrow and circumscribed one, they fell at the same time into the other extreme, and sought an unbound circle of action for at least their intellect and feelings. They devoted themselves to the world, under the then favourite title of cosmopolitans, that is, citizens of the world, or to mankind, under the equally favourite name of humanity. About German nationality, however, and about the country's interests, not a word was said. The narrow-minded provincialism of the common people did not rise to such a height, and geniuses soared far above them into the regions of the universality of mankind. That explains why even Lessing, during the 7 Years' War, interests himself in everything else excepting this war which was destroying his country. That is the reason why Goethe, still later, took no part in the great events of Germany, and felt only that they unpleasantly disturbed his poetic dreams. Even Schiller declares once in a letter to Kerner, "Patriotism is something limited. True genius can never be inspired for one nation, but only for all mankind." The enthusiasm which seized upon the youth of Germany in the latter half of the last century, the so-called storm and stress period, was in reality only aimed at the emancipation of humanity, or the humane, and was by no means a national tendency. Nay, it was originally derived from France. It was only adopted from Rousseau. King Frederick II won immortal fame when he defeated the French at Rossbach, and turned the fear of them into ridicule. French policy, seizing every opportunity to rob Germany again, broke the agreement with Prussia, to which it was indebted for Naples and Lorraine. Immediately after the death of Charles VI, it did not recognise the beautiful Maria Theresa as his heir, and it sent new armies to Germany. Meanwhile, Prussia reconciled itself with Maria Theresa, and France went away empty-handed. With so much the greater eagerness did France now join the coalition of Austria, Russia, Saxony, and Sweden, which was intended to conquer and divide Prussia. The infamous plot was devised in the heart of France, at Versailles. If it had succeeded, France would have carried off a part of the booty. It would have gained a German district in the west, but the military genius of Frederick and the stable loyalty of Prussia frustrated the whole plan. The endangered state of Prussia came out of the 7 Years' War more gloriously than ever, and France again got nothing. Yet by no means did Frederick use the humiliation of the French to teach the Germans a great political lesson, to explain to them the faithless policy of France, which never grew old, to excite their animosity against France, to tear away the bonds which French thought and taste, French literature and fashion had bound them. On the contrary, he did everything to establish and extend the influence of those very French whom he had defeated on the field of battle, whom he had made even ridiculous, over German education and civilization. He preferred to read, speak, and write French. He despised German philosophers and poets. with a few exceptions hardly worth mentioning, and invited to his court only French scholars and poets, some of whom were the most demoralized characters. He immediately favoured the most perfect freedom of the press upon questions of morality and religion, but not upon political topics, and, as the young Emperor Joseph II followed his example, Germany was soon flooded with translations and imitations of immoral and irreligious works with which France was then overflowing. After the death of Lessing, who had fought so valiantly against the earlier Gallic mania, a new, still fiercer mania broke out. It was time that the old French play, the beloved pastoral scenes, the obscene mythology, etc., were banished, but in their place appeared the new French philosophical romances, which were consistently and intelligently planned for the complete destruction of all the moral and religious principles of society. Goethe and his new school, just then beginning to flourish, were unable to direct this influx of French frivolity, nor did they wish to, but rather yielded to it in many respects. Just as Wieland had also done, still earlier, and in this respect he differed from Lessing, and just as the lesser but very popular poets were still doing, for example, the Nicolai school, Kotzebue, etc. French ideas, however, had the greatest influence upon the secret societies, among which that of the Illuminati had the definite purpose of causing the downfall of Christianity. To such an unlimited extent did French culture prevail among us, without any influence from Germany being felt in turn in France. At that time it was assumed to be a well-known fact that the French were the exemplary people of culture, and compared with the other nations of Europe, just as the Greeks once did with the surrounding barbarians, Scythians, etc. The French not only affected an inexpressible scorn for the Germans, but they actually overflowed with it. In Germany, the people were contented with this, for the great Frederick himself unconditionally recognized the superiority of the French. Even the more enlightened minds and prouder spirits of that time, though they censured much that was French, and were busily engaged in honouring what was German in turn, allowed themselves to be overawed by the fine language and by the dazzling ideas of the then immensely popular French philosophers who, under the guidance of Rousseau, promised the renaissance of humanity, the realization of an ideal government, the fulfilment of all the dreams of world reformers. The philosophical school of Kant and Fichte, the rationalism in Protestant theology striving for supremacy, many inspired poets and historians shared in these sympathies. Although German scholarship and German thought made themselves otherwise felt, in works of science and in poetry, in many ways independent of French influence, yet there was never at that time a genuine national party in Germany. There was nowhere a centre for national opposition and reaction against the universal prevalent French ideas, nowhere a patriotic consciousness that resolutely headed itself against the stream. Such was the position of Germanism to Gallic Romanism immediately preceding the French Revolution. This great event has, as is well known, already been variously criticised. French philosophy has boasted that it had foreseen it, had prepared for it, but it is not so. The philosophy, the educated classes, and the press were not capable of improvising such a catastrophe. Only the bankruptcy of the government, and only the extreme poverty of the lower classes, of those very classes that troubled themselves least about philosophy and literature, that were not even able to read, these brought about the revolution, and then, of course, all the noble and just passions of the educated classes intermingled in it. These last have been justly accredited with having had a great share in this terrible event, but it was only a share in the development of the same, not in its origin. Quite apart from the opinions and practices of the higher classes, the revolution broke out as a physical necessity and originated in the wretchedness and poverty of the provinces, not from the intellectual revelries of the capital. In truth, one is bound to maintain, and this was not evident to the people at that time, that the revolution was a revival of the old Franconian, that is, Germanic element of popular freedom and popular representation, so long suppressed in France, a reaction against the new Gallic-Roman element of despotism that arose with Louis XIV. The people simply desired to recover the old Franconian, old Burgundian constitution, in a word, the ancient German institutions of primary assemblies, of military jurisdiction, of imperial assembly. Hence the agreement of the new French constitution with that of the English, hence all the advantages of the representative system. Had the French people been able to act for themselves when they began this revolution, its Germanic character would have been still more clearly represented. But from the beginning the philosophers of the capital interfered with it. They latently falsified the original character of the revolution, while they most eagerly gave their services to it and obtruded themselves upon it as leaders. These philosophers, with their customary arrogance, now declare that the revolution was by no means a reaction of freedom-loving Germanism against despotic Romanism, but, on the very contrary, a reaction of the Gallic Roman people, long ago oppressed by the Franconian kings and nobles, against those same foreign usurpers. But the French knew very well what they were doing when they devised this falsehood. They intended to rob the Germanic nation of the ancient glory of its institutions, and to ascribe to themselves alone the honour of having thus rediscovered liberty. One need not be amazed at it, yet one cannot but be surprised to find that German historians and politicians credit and repeat it. The English also are guilty of this mistake. Jealous of France, they, with Edmund Burke at their head, are wholly unwilling to grant that the French Revolution proceeded from a desire on the part of the unfortunate people for Germanic principles, for a constitution like that of the English, and they take pleasure in unanimously proclaiming this to be a fantastic imitation of ancient republics. These same Jacobins of the capital, who acquired control of the Revolution, and whose actions, as is well known, naturally awakened opposition in the provinces, have also held fast to the Gallic Roman principle, chiefly because the French again planned conquests in Germany. A number of the German Illuminati, cosmopolitans, and freedom enthusiasts rushed to meet them. These men, in whom there was not a trace of national pride and patriotism, even begged them to come to Germany and to introduce here the new French freedom. They vied with one another in offering them cities and provinces, and besought them, as if for a favour, to unite to France that basely betrayed Mayence, the last bulwark on the upper Rhine after the loss of Strasbourg. Even Georg Forster, the celebrated circumnavigator of the globe, one of the most respected scholars of Germany, was conspicuous in this embassy of Mayence citizens, traitors to their country. All this was natural. Who was willing to get excited over it? Such consequences were unavoidable when once all the earlier events had taken place. We described above the feeling in Germany before the Reformation. The Illuminati and their friends, the admirers of French literature and philosophy, were legion, and unfortunately the people of Germany were so unused to freedom, especially scholars and writers had learned to take so little part in the political life of their country, that the novelty of freedom, the thought of possible cooperation in the affairs of state surprised, electrified, and inspired them with a manly, at the same time childish, desire for political activity. Now, since this was denied them in their own country, and since the very first notice of the outbreak of the French Revolution, strict guard and police inspection were instituted in Germany, these people, intoxicated with freedom, emigrated to France. They betook themselves to Paris, or waited here at least, for the coming of the Salvation. The Jacobins of Paris received their German friends very well at first. They were afraid of Russia and Austria. They were attacked by these powers. They hoped to devise a diversion for these powers by a revolution in Germany, and in addition much weight was laid on the friendship which the German enthusiasts proffered them. They honoured the latter very highly. Would one believe that a Prussian, Baron Cloots, became president of the Jacobin Club, and a Swiss parson, Gorbel, became Archbishop of Paris? The latter solemnly laid aside his priestly canonicals in the National Convention, and forswore the Christian religion, an example followed by the entire French Republic. But how greatly deceived were these enthusiasts when they fancied that they could make use of the French, for they themselves were only the instruments of the French. As soon as the Jacobins perceived that the support of the Illuminati in Germany was not great enough to revolutionize our empire in form, and since they, on the other hand, dared to hope for Prussia's separation from the coalition, they made short work with all these obtrusive German enthusiasts in Paris, and had them repaid for their good faith by scornfully cutting off their heads. The policy of conquest was much dearer to the hearts of the French than liberty. The new republicans had no scruples against flattering a king, a German king, indeed, at the very moment when they had hardly ceased to assure the German people of republican liberty. They troubled themselves little about the principle, if it had any profit in it. And unfortunately Prussia entered into the treaty. It was jealous of Austria, and it believed that it was acting according to the wish of the great Frederick, who had recently died, when it formed an alliance with France against Austria. It surrendered itself to an extremely disastrous deception. Prussia, the young state in which rested the future of Germany, had to do everything that served the universal German interests. It dare do nothing that imperilled the same. It had to represent the national honour in opposition to the old traditional foe of the empire, the overbearing neighbour. It did not dare to assume an ambiguous, and indeed a hostile attitude towards the rest of Germany. It never dared to make a common cause with the enemy of Germany. Wisdom had already forbidden it to confide in French friendship, for France had always defrauded its friends in Germany. Prussia, having first outstripped Austria in a fierce contest, was now running after France and took only a lukewarm part in the war. Soon it stopped altogether, and finally concluded the one-sided treaty with France at Bâle, 1795. By this means Austria was isolated, repulsed, defeated. The entire left bank of the Rhine and the Netherlands were lost to Germany. By means of this well-devised treaty of peace with Prussia, the French avoided the troublesome duty of keeping their promises to the people. That dangerous method of exciting the people was no longer necessary now, for the enemies of France were not to be feared after the separation of Prussia from the coalition, so they were no longer bound by the promise to liberate the people. Now they could again make conquests and rob the rich frontier lands of the German Empire in the old-fashioned way, without being the least ashamed of it. So the Netherlands, Holland, the Rhenish electorates, the Palatinate, and soon afterwards Switzerland, were not liberated by the Brotherly League, as had been promised, but they were hostilely vanquished and overrun with a military and civil army of robbers that plundered by force all the public and private wealth of the countries mentioned, or understood how to steal it away with the skill and trickery of financial magicians. The French commissioners thought of everything, took everything. The Netherlanders and Hollanders and citizens of Treves protested in vain. The French had declared that they wished only to free them, to salute them as a free people, had solemnly promised them their autonomy, free elections, independence, republican honour, republican happiness. And now they treat them like conquered enemies, they take away everything, do not allow free elections, brutally dictate to them and leave them nothing but blind obedience. If they had to exchange merely one form of tyranny for another, and a bad condition for a worse, why did they promise them liberty? After that, the provinces of Germany across the Rhine were plundered of everything. They kept, of course, their political and civil institutions, which, in comparison with the earlier state of affairs, must be looked upon as an improvement, a salutary reform. However, these people were deceived as regards the origin of these institutions. They received them as something altogether new, which could have been invented only by French ingenuity, or which were the results of the ancient republicanism born again in France. But they were nothing else than old Germanic institutions, borrowed first of all from England, where old German liberty has been preserved in its purest and most ancient form. The jury, for example, was neither something new, exclusively French, nor something antique, but an English, originally a Germanic institution, which had formerly been developed among the Franks, as among all German tribes. The Swiss were the most miserable at that time. For centuries they had pursued an anti-national policy against Germany. They had wronged their German kinsmen in every way. The French they had favoured in every way. Hundreds of thousands of Swiss had fallen from time to time, while fighting for France, in the wars of the Reformation, of Louis XIV and XV. They had shed their life's blood to make France great. As Germans, they had fought against Germans, in order that France, laughing both to scorn, should alone succeed. Now they were earning their reward. In vain did they explain that they had long been free, ever since the time of William Tell, that it was not at all necessary that the French should come, with the pretext of liberating them now, for the first time. They humbly prayed that the French would not liberate them. "Be silent," was the command. "You must let yourselves be freed." So the French came, conquered the country, ruled it by their own creatures, did not observe free elections, declared those null which had been boldly held notwithstanding, and stole like the ravens. With the millions which were seized here, Bonaparte equipped the navy and army with which he went to Egypt, and the Copts and Arabs tested the value of the old gold pieces of Bern on the foot of the pyramids. As soon as France had assured itself of the conquest of the entire left bank of the Rhine and Italy, it ceased to be a republic. Both events resulted from the same cause. The French people dissatisfied, passionately enraged against king and nobility, embittered with the intendants and financial frauds, were avenged by the death of the king and by the emigration of the nobles. The bankruptcy of the state had been averted, and besides, they had now conquered the neighbouring lands and enriched themselves with the booty. So the people were now satisfied. What need had they now of the phantom of the Republic? Napoleon blew it away by a breath. Napoleon alone was now the man of the nation, for he understood, as a French king before him never had, how to flatter the two chief passions of the nation, desire for fame and covetousness. He led them to victory everywhere, and he gave them the plundered booty of all countries. The poor German Empire, it had to behold all these changes in France, and to suffer anew under each of them. Under how many false pretences, for what totally opposing principles, had the French not come to us already, in order to rob under the mask of giving us assistance? That ancient kingdom of Burgundy they tore from us, in the name of the Pope and of the only saving Church. The bishoprics of Lorraine and Alsace they tore from us, in the name of the Reformation, as the protectors of the Lutherans. Strasbourg and the Republic of Holland they seized in the name of the absolute monarchy. Spain, Naples, Burgundy, and Lorraine they won in the name of legitimacy. And finally Holland, the Netherlands, the entire left bank of the Rhine, and Switzerland, they united, or allied at least most closely with France, in the name of liberty and of republican principle. 4 times they changed that principle, but with each change they stole away land from us. And so it was at least certain that Napoleon no longer needed an excuse, that he discarded the hypocritical mask of principles and openly appeared as a robber, when he made interest alone answer the purpose of policy, and despised no means to attain that end. Napoleon stole into the hearts of the French, and he will always dwell there, not only because he was a great man, but still more because he most boldly expressed and accomplished what all the French think and desire, because by his very greatness he excused the odiousness of covetousness, which is the secret of their nationality. One may say what one will, but Napoleon has to thank his genius for the admiration of the French, but for their love he has to thank only his profound immorality. In Germany, this great military genius found half the work already done. The left bank of the Rhine, together with both our flanks, Holland on one side, Switzerland on the other, had already been torn from us. Prussia was already separated from Austria, and was neutral, when Napoleon drove the steeds of his chariot of victory for the first time over the plains of Germany. Had he been half the great man that he actually was, he would have overpowered us. Our empire was not accustomed to valiant uprisings and popular summons, but rather, to the contrary, to cowardly fear, cringing obedience, and humiliation, no matter to whom it humbled itself. Warlike Prussia did nothing for the rescue of the empire, it rather hindered it by its neutrality, which was almost equivalent to an alliance with France, and Austria alone had already shed half its lifeblood, having fought under the leadership of its ancient imperial house with the noblest endurance and loyalty. The consequences are well known. The western part of the empire was formed into a new Rhenish confederacy, like the former, under the protectorate of France, with the special advantage to Germany that even the last remnants of state and municipal liberty were destroyed, and a completely despotic form of government was introduced everywhere. Austria was robbed of its western and southern provinces. Prussia reaped the same gratitude from France that Switzerland had earlier. It was rewarded for its loyalty with abuse and insult. Finally, it was cast out and almost ruined. If Prussia had not concluded the Treaty of Bâle, had it rendered loyal aid to Austria, had it also encouraged the rest of the imperial allies, and had it used beforehand the abundance of men and money among the nobler classes, then in possession of Germany, for great united efforts against France, instead of letting this abundance soon afterwards fall into the hands of the French, France would have been conquered, perhaps. At least it would have been forced to make a fair treaty of peace. But Prussia did nothing. And this right wing of the German situation quietly beheld how the left one, Austria, was broken. That Napoleon would also fall at once upon the right wing, which could no longer be aided by the broken left one, hence must be conquered, Prussia could easily have imagined. Will Germany, indeed, ever understand that it is always important for France to smite one half of Germany through the other, or after the other, as it has never been able to manage the whole? Meanwhile, although under the present circumstances Napoleon easily got the better of Germany, an inner presentiment said to him, nevertheless, these obedient subjects, these amiable neighbours that suffer themselves to be beaten on both sides like drums, these phlegmatic Germans, and he was fond of honouring them with the title Dummheit, stupidity, are not to be wholly trusted. Sometimes there can be a thunderstorm among them, and the lightning may strike him. Therefore, he not only took steps to divide the Germans, to estrange the various tribes of the same people from one another, more than they had been, to flatter one to terrify the other, and on whole to weaken them, to keep the German press under the strictest censorship, to check personal freedom by the police, an institution of this kind almost new in Germany, etc. But he also believed that a great European offensive and defensive alliance of Romanism and Slavism was necessary in order to hold Germanism securely down. Therefore, he formed his close alliance with Emperor Alexander in the year 1807. This alliance of the Romans and Slavs had been planned already between Louis XIV and Peter the Great for the destruction of Germany. Only because one took Alsace could the other take Livland. Now the ruin of Germany was carried on about a century longer. The French ruled not only on the Rhine, but also on the Elbe, and the Russians already held Livland, Kussland, Eschland, and almost all Poland, and he also took Finland. If this alliance had lasted longer, Germany would have been completely destroyed by it, for no one would have dared to oppose this coalition if it had declared, Prussia has ceased to exist. Even Austria would have had to succumb. It is not improper for us to recall what humiliations befell our honourable ancient princely houses at Erfurt and Dresden, how insolently they were treated by the French, and no less by the Russians, for Alexander had not so much delicacy as to be absent from the great hare hunt which Napoleon had prepared in the battlefield of Jena 2 years after the battle. One may and should, in truth, think of such insults, in order that one may recall also from time to time what there is to do to prevent their return. The slow, gradual annihilation of the last remnant of independence possessed by the German princes and the German nation, which would have inevitably followed, if France and Russia had remained united for a time, was fortunately spared us, not however by our own merit, but by the miraculous dispensation of God. Russia and France begrudged each other the booty, and became enemies. If this was a great stroke of good fortune for Germany, for which we are not able to thank heaven enough, yet there is associated with it a reflection of the most painful nature. Never before, during the 2,000 years that German history has been recorded, were all Germans subject to the will of a foreigner. Never had the Romans forced us to yield. Attila himself had subdued only a part of the Germans. The others fought under independent princes against him, and conquered him. Now, for the first time, in the year 1812, were all Germans, without exception, obliged to serve a foreign master. all German states, without exception, had to furnish soldiers to a foreign lord, and to submit to the command of a foreigner in order to fight for a foreign cause. When this disgrace of a nation, which for 2,000 years had been the sovereign of Europe, became evident, heaven itself seemed to find it unendurable, and gave its sign to remind men what they ought to have done, even with its aid. Truly, those great natural terrors that announced the fall of Napoleon caused the German nation to be deeply ashamed. Now, for the first time, the nation started up in wild rage, ardent for vengeance, terrible as nature whose sign it had seen. But the enthusiasm came, indeed, somewhat late. We are obliged to ask, with amazement, why did the Germans now first do what they could have done long before? How many provinces, how many millions of money had the Germans allowed to be seized from them since the times of Louis XIV? With the means which they had negligently surrendered to the French, they could have pursued the latter, even across the Seine, more than 100 years before. A union of the princes, a general summons of the people could have taken place much earlier, and would have had just as favourable a result as in the year 1813. However, it is a natural characteristic of the German people that they take time in all matters. They completed the Reformation too, after a long trial of patience. What necessity did was done at last, though tardily. The German princes united, the German people arose en masse, and more was not needed to conquer France's entire force, and the hero of the century. The zeal and the talent of the German generals, the enthusiasm and bravery of the armies themselves were extraordinary, and especially so, indeed, because the war was waged by the entire nation as such. This gave it the emphasis, this the rare enthusiasm, and this sent that terror before the armies which nothing resists. When such a great people as the Germans become angered, and arise in a body, France must tremble, even though it had 10 Napoleons. People and army waged the war purely as a national war. At that time, not only Napoleon was hated, but the French also. Since, however, the German governments did not conduct the war alone, though the German armies alone decided the issue. Since Russia especially had great influence, and Russia was more afraid of an increase of German power, because the Germans were nearer, than the continuance of a strong French state which was more distant, and could be of future service to Russia against Germany. In the very midst of the war itself, diplomacy was already planning not to allow the victory of the Germans over the French to go too far. This was expressed in the explanation that the war was not a national war, not a war against France, but only against the person of Napoleon. Upon this understanding also the treaty was concluded. The opportunity was offered Germany to revenge with one blow all the injuries which it had suffered for centuries from France, to take back all the provinces that had been torn from the German Empire, but this opportunity was not used. France kept not only Italian Burgundy and Italian Lorraine, but also German Alsace and German Lorraine. It kept Strasbourg, the key of Upper Germany. Also the potent messenger of conquered France sat in the Congress of Vienna, and in judgment over Germany, for example, over the division of Saxony, while no representative of a German principality was allowed to meddle with the matter of the new French constitution. In the meantime, the new constitution of France was made to copy the English, constitutional king with 2 houses, etc., thus again essentially Germanic in its nature. After the great tragic comedy of the Renaissance, the antique republic and the antique despotism had been played out. A return was made to the original want which caused the revolution, namely, the need of Germanic guarantees, of old Frankish popular representation according to the classes. Germany had exerted all its force to win the victory, but not to employ the victory equally as well. However, the simple fact that the entire French force, all French pride, all the military genius of France were not a match for the popular call of the Germans was well worth knowing. It demonstrated to the French what Germany was able to do if it wished. It instilled a shyness into them, but it tempted us to dare. It taught their heads to reflect that if the Germans some time in the future should be inclined to make a general call against France once again, the victory would be just as little doubtful, but that afterwards this victory would be employed perhaps more to the advantage of Germany and to the loss of France than this first one. End of section 3.